Welcome to part two of strategic decision making. And here we're going to start with looking at the theory surrounding decisions. And let's have a look at the elements in the process. So when we're looking at decision making, we first need to identify what might be happening in the future. So we're looking ahead to what we might call states of nature, and they may be different. You can recollect that this is not too dissimilar to scenario planning, though that is a very different methodology. So in terms of this, you can see straight away that it does require imagination and creativity. It's not something that we can do, if you like, rationally uh, or in a way that is there is a methodology, but it's not rational in the sense it's got numbers, it's quantitative, and so on. It does require us to think ahead. We then need to think about, well, what are the solutions that might exist? So we may have these future states, but where do we go from there? What is the possible solution? And what we'll find is because there's different types of states of nature, as they're called, we'll get solutions for each. So solution one, solution two. There'll be alternative depending on which path we take. And then finally, we're looking at payoff. And payoff really is the balance between competing aspects. Uh, Typically, payoff may mean, well, what do we actually get? And it's slightly different trade-off, which is what are you trading against? So it's rational in the sense that it's just looking at specific problem solution, but it may be limited because possibly that isn't the way the world works. And then from that, through this kind of iteration, we end up with some kind of decision criteria. What is it? How are we going to judge the solutions when we reach them? And we'll just take a step aside a minute and just look at sort of the different types of uh, decisions that we might be looking for. So we may have maxi-max, which is we're just looking for the best possible payoff. So against two separate solutions, we just want the one that has the best payoff. Maxi-min may be a situation where we've got a number of different uh, solutions, but there is some, and they range from high to low. And the question is, what should we actually be looking at? And because of maybe, let's say, resources and capabilities, we may just adopt, we can't go for the best possible payoff. We may go for something that's if you like, the least worst. And uh, the least worst solution. There's the Laplace type approach where we look at all of these, have an average payoff of the alternatives. This is more theoretical than actual because, of course, in many cases we can only have one solution. We can't have an average of all of them. And then finally, the minimax regret, whereby what one is looking for is uh, in terms of the future, what might we regret the most? And so this may include perhaps following a market leader with a product, and we have an option of not following the market leader or following, and we may just go for the least work. What would we regret most? Well, we would regret the most if the product was to succeed. We may actually look at pricing. If the market leader decides to go into a price war, where do we put our price? What would we least regret? Clearly, keeping a big gap between the price of the market leader and our own product may not be tenable, but we may not necessarily have to go all the way down to the price that the market leader is indicating. But you can see when you look at this, there's a kind of complexity even when you look at decision making. And one can see that whilst you have all of these theoretical sort of uh, ways of looking at it, the way human beings work is like to be something that emerges out of discussion rather than something that one is going for. Uh, in terms of elements and process, let's have a look at the the way we may actually use states of nature and so on. And using the example in part one around international joint ventures, let's let's start with one and say that what the company is doing is looking to internationalize. And in terms of internationalization, it may have two options: the international joint venture or M&A. I'm not going to look at the M&A. You can choose to do it yourself as you go through. Uh, we then, as we go to sort of chance events, the chance events may be just simply who is available uh, for uh, for the joint venture. And we may have two states. We may have possibly an ideal partner where there is a kind of fit, strategic fit, cultural fit, and so on. We may have uh, somebody who is really, in our opinion, going to be opportunistic about the possibility of an IJV. But depending on strategy, we may want to go down that route anyway because it may be the only way that we can get into the it's the only way that we can get into uh, the country that we're thinking of entering through this mode of entry. So let's go to the state of nature where there is a fit, and the payoff, we can give it a kind of percentage. The payoff is going to be market entry and growth. And we can say that perhaps there's an 80% chance, we can perhaps give a probability there's an 80% chance that's going to work because there's a good fit, but of course there's always space for failure. In terms of an opportunistic partner, then we have two options. We can actually go or we can not go. We can decide not to actually do it at all. If we don't go, then we've got 0% payoff because we're not actually doing it. In which case, when you look at this, this is where an M&A or a greenfield site even can become uh, something that we would prefer to having a partner who's opportunistic. But if we decide to go, then and it may be, as I mentioned earlier, we have to go because it's our only way and it's the best way. It's the least regretful way of doing it because if we go to the M&A, there's a lot of money involved and there's lots of risk there as well. So if we go through there, it may be the payoff is 50-50. We're not certain, and again, these percentages are simply it's the art of this. These are not real in the sense that they're actual, but it's a way of judging the rank order, the kind of uh, rather than something that's specific. So we can see here an example where we've gone down the states of nature based on the decision points based on chance events that might occur. And here we would have to choose, we would then make a choice if the choice is available. We can have another look at cause and effect diagrams because this is part of how we look at decision theory. And um, I'm going to uh, I'm going to approach this from the basis that actually it's quite difficult to get a sense of what cause and effect is because often things are pretty complex and trying to say what causes anything can be very difficult. However, they can help us in our thinking. And one of the cause and effects we might have to look at is uh, how do you gain a distinction uh, at at uh, at university? So your distinction is where you want to finally get into, but to get the distinction, then it requires as a cause and effect for you to attend lectures. And if you attend lectures, this will help you when you come to do your revision, and revising at the end can lead to distinction, but attending lectures means that you can revise well. You may want to, in terms of revision, look at exam papers, past exam papers, and we have a sense that if we look at past exam papers, then they will help to guide the revision, which will then help towards a distinction. And you can build it up from there, but we can see that, for example, attending lectures may lead to that, but it's a causal network, but it doesn't mean to say that in a particular instance this is what will actually work. And you noticed I've used arrows to help in that, to help in the kind of flow, the way things work. So in revision of past exam papers, sometimes we can revise, go to past exam papers, revise again, then return to the past exam papers to see whether we would have done something differently. And so we can put a two-headed arrows, which shows that causality can go both ways. Another way of looking at cause and effect is to use the fishbone a fishbone diagram. And a fishbone diagram is a more formalized way of cause and effect. And here what we do is we would think about where we are and where we want to get to. And in terms of where we want to get to, it may be that we are product centric, product centric in terms of our culture and approach, and we want to become customer centric. So the question is, uh, how do we do that? What are the cause and effect issues? And actually, why we want to do this in the first place could be something that could be considered. So a main cause of this may be what our competitors are doing. So competitors and indeed the industry, if we just have it in general, is moving towards that. And why they're moving towards that? Uh, because customers' expectations have risen. We also may be wanting to do that as a cause. A main cause is that by going to customer centric, we can start thinking of how customer service may help in terms of future future revenues. So we may decide to have something customer centric, but that may include helping them, for example, if they buy a computer, to helping them to set it up, coming to the home and setting up. And again, that might actually lead to future revenues, but it's also a response to what customers want. And you can have all sorts of minor reasons in there, and you can build up a kind of picture for why all of this is happening. And again, you can have further uh, uh, causes, and you can see why it's called a fishbone diagram, because you're building it up. And again, one of the reasons for doing it is often to try and get a sense of make sense of what's happening in the industry, to identify factors, and then that can help us in decision making. But it's more analytic, it's not determinative, it's not telling us what we should do, it's telling us what the picture of the situation is, and as a picture that can be very helpful. And it's a picture, but it's a picture that once we use it, it also creates insight, in the same way that when we did the decision tree, it provides insight, because in order to fill, if you like, or populate the diagram with material, case material, or material from the situation, we have to make choices, we have to think about it, and that can help in our decision making. Likewise, cause and effect diagrams. Uh, when we are making decisions, we have a number of approaches. One of those is to optimize the decision we're making. Is there an optimal solution to a problem? And this is often used in approached at by mathematical techniques like linear programming. Uh, but you can see that one of the problems with it is it's often just one problem. And actually, do we ever have just one problem? And even if we have one problem, can we actually solve it analytically? And actually, very few optimization problems can be solved analytically, because it's within a context. The solution often depends on many other factors that exist. If we now move on to satisficing, should we forgetting about the optimal, which is almost like the one best way, maybe we need to go for satisficing and say and recognize that often when we do things, not only there are multiple objectives, but some of them can be competing. We may be wanting to have, for example, cost leadership whilst at the same time differentiating. So it's very difficult to know what the best solution is. And in those in those situations, it can be very helpful to think about not a single best solution, but perhaps many best solutions, or satisficing solutions. So let's have an example of that. And again, we can talk about the kind of exam mark that you might want to get in the effort. So if we say that, and again, if we look at distinction level, then in order to get into distinction or beyond, we have a line that we need to cross. How does effort work? Is effort and what you get a linear line? In my experience, and this is both experience, my observations, and so on, and having done exams myself, my view is it's more like this. The the It's more like this in terms of effort. In order to get further and further marks, you have to put more effort in to get the same marks. So we can see here that something like the effort required to get 50% of the marks is less than is required to get the next 20%. The next 20% to get up to distinction level. And you can see the effort is a ratio of 1 to 2. So you need to put twice as much effort in to get the next 20%. And what we might recognize is in terms of balancing the time that we have and so on. If we've got time, we'll put that time in. But for some people, it might be, look, I'm going to put this amount of time in because it's a reasonable amount. I'll get a merit, but I've got time to do all the other activities I want to do in the university. And this is satisfying. It's good enough. It's not a fail. It's not a distinction, but it is good enough. In all of this, we also have to look at whether we're doing things which are suboptimal or non-optimal at all. And by that, we can look at it from the point of view, for example, silos, where you have different departments that exist within the organization, but they don't talk to each other. They operate in silos, and this is suboptimal because it's meant to be an organization, and yet it's turned out into several organizations. And this suboptimization is exactly what corporations try to do. So, in terms of corporate strategy, one of the values that corporations can add is they can look at silos and say, actually, we can look at the linkages, and in this case, it wouldn't be within an organization, but it would be organization. We can look at linkages and look to create knowledge transfer, and that can add value. Or we can look at, and what that would mean is we're looking at our portfolio and saying, what can we give this portfolio of organizations? It could be linkages, or it could be centralized services, which means that those organizations don't have to be repeating, for example, payroll, when it can be done centrally and benefit from scale economies and having experts in one place and so on. So often we're looking for optimization, and in terms of corporate strategy, we can see that as a kind of parenting advantage. So is it suboptimal? Can we get it to optimal? If we can't get optimal, is there a sense that is there a sense that actually it's good enough in terms of what we're doing? And often good enough is often thought about in relation to our competitors. So bringing sort of this kind of together, if we look at problem-solving process, then we can see that many of the things that are needed, and this all looks reasonable, is in terms of information, there may be bias. we may want to do some kind of stochastic approach, some kind of random sampling, which may give us some better understanding if we're able to do it. But even if we're able to do it, what meaning do we attach to it? And so reasoning and knowledge is attaching meaning to the research that we have done. And in terms of attaching meaning, this also requires some kind of creative process, which is again related to the human factor. What sense do we make out of it? What meaning do we attach to it? And how does that help us in our decision-making action? And you can see how, as we talked in part one, you have Jeffrey Vickers' three types of um, judgment. Do we have a reality judgment here? What's the value judgment? And how do we action it? When we do all that, we then need to observe what's happening. Again, observation, again, is the human factor. So we have to be very conscious of the biases that we may be operating with. And so in a problem-solving process which looks rational, the way it operates, that human factor, the biases that come in, uh, is critical to the decision making that we eventually make. And as we know, once we've made a decision, it can be hard to reverse, and typically there will be resources that are implied in this. So why? So if we look at the human factor, the key aspect of human factor is the idea of bounded rationality. That when we look at the world from our vantage point, we can only see a certain amount. It's bounded because cognitively we can't go beyond that. If we had time, we could. If we had money, and time, even better. If we had a chance to learn and think about what's happening, if we've got time to philosophize, if we've got time to theorize, we may get past our bounded rationality. But sometimes, if we have all those things, there's the unavailability of information, and most managers never have the fullest information. They don't have the time as a luxury to think about it, and they've got to make decisions. So the question is, how do we deal with this? Well, one of the ways is to recognize that we may have our bounded rationality, but when we work in teams, and there'll be overlaps, there'll be others that can bring a different perspective in, different perspective. And so in internationalization, we know that one of the things that we try and do is to get multicultural teams, and especially teams from both who are expatriates as well as people from the country that we're in order to build up a picture. And this kind of unbounding, if we take it further, we recognize unbounding is happening because when we think about intelligence, often intelligence, we can only look at it from the point of view of intelligent acts. It's very difficult to think of it past that. And if you like, intelligent acts are similar to making what some people might call the right decisions. For me, because of the issue of hubris in that, rather than saying something's right, what we can ask is, do our decisions work? Or why haven't they worked? It takes out some of the aspects of being humans. It takes out some of the biases, such as hubris and fundamental attribution error, where we think that we're only looking at things that put us in a good light. We really need to be more egoless and go. And once we're egoless, we can at least some of those biases they are lost, and we start to look much more clearly at what's going on. I mentioned the aspect of teams, and teams also bring the idea of transactive memories, and that is that whilst we might not know about a certain aspect, uh, we can tap into the memory of other people through the stories they tell. So if we have a team which has somebody from marketing, somebody from new product development, somebody from finance, each of them have their own expertise and experience in the area that they work in. But when they tell stories, we can benefit from their expertise, and suddenly our understanding can emerge and be can emerge and can grow. So boundary rationality isn't necessarily a fixed boundary, but it's a boundary nevertheless. And the final point really here is that it's really critical to think about conation, and conation is really how we feel. So when we do things, exactly are we doing? Well, firstly, often without being aware of it, we're feeling what's occurring. We're feeling our way through, especially if it's something new. And in that feeling, we're then starting to think. So we're thinking about our feelings. What are our feelings telling us? And feelings aren't who you are, in my view. And this is actually a view that is taken certainly in a number of religions, Buddhism being one example. Feelings aren't who we are, but feelings are a way of understanding the world. They literally are sensing the world, and the way we feel is telling us something not about necessarily us, but about what's happening out there. So in that feeling, we're thinking, and that can affect the feeling, what are we actually feeling here? And then from that feeling thinking, we have to do something. And in that doing, we're then feeling as well. What does it feel like to be doing that? What are we learning, thinking? And carnation is that idea of feeling. Positive affect is very important. So rather than seeing things as right and wrong and therefore we blame ourselves and get involved in all sorts of biases to protect our self-esteem, by looking at whether something works or not works, we keep a positive outlook. And that positive effect, some people might call it happiness. I mean, I think happiness is a socially bound word which has lots of kind of problems with it. But that aspect, but seeing it just as positive effect, meaning that we have a positive outlook, uh, tends to mean that we just see more. We see a wider picture, and we're more likely, again, to when we're talking with someone else who has feelings as well, when we share those feelings, right, they then affect our thinking and our doing and back. And of course, it affects them as well, feeling, thinking, doing. And this is a very critical aspect of humanity, and part of going beyond unbounding, around our bounded rationality, is to recognize how when we work communally, we can gain a lot. And it also helps us understand why in companies, often we don't just have one strategist, we have strategy teams, because it recognizes both the value of human beings but also their limitations. Thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope you found it useful.